welcome to the Montesquieu Forum. A long time ago, I went to graduate school at Michigan State University, and the chair of the department was an Irishman named Bill Callahan, who was a delight and very helpful to me. Much more helpful to me, however, was his wife, Mary, who was from Italy and could cook pasta 161 different ways. And she would have me over for dinner regularly, but never during the summer. Because during the summer, Bill and Mary took a Polish freighter out of New Jersey for Italy. One year they went there on a specific mission to the University of Padua in order to see Galileo's chair. Galileo was pretty observant, caught sight of mountains on our moon, and 4 moons of Jupiter. They thought, let's examine the seat in which he sat to take these observations. They showed up there in late June. Michigan State was on quarters and ended at the beginning of June. And this being Italy, and this being the summer, no one was on campus, except a janitor. They tried to convey to the janitor they were looking for Galileo's chair. They thought, surely it must be displayed in a room with a long discussion, perhaps even a booklet or a pamphlet indicating what it is. And the janitor ran off in pursuit of Galileo's chair and came back and said, "No, I'm so sorry to tell you. So sorry. Galileo was a chair, but he was a chair of, not this chair, but which brings me to today's speaker. Our speaker today is Vickie Sullivan from Tufts, who holds the Cornelia M. Jackson Chair of Political Science. This chair began 125 years ago this year in honor of Cornelia Jackson, dedicated to equality of learning, independent of gender, independent of race, independent of everything except the willingness to get an education. Professor Sullivan got her undergraduate degree at Carleton College, and her 2 professors, Michael and Catherine Zucker, are with us today. She then went on to the University of Chicago, where she wrote her doctorate on Machiavelli under the tutelage of Professor Nathan Tarkov, who's also with it today. I think it says something about Professor Sullivan that both her undergraduate teachers and her graduate teacher have appeared. Now, it's true they all live in Chicago. It's also true that they live within walking distance of Roosevelt University. But nevertheless, no one was twisting their arms, and they are here today. Professor Sullivan has taught at Tufts for many years. However, it was not her first teaching position. The first course she ever taught in 1988 was at Roosevelt University in this building on constitutional law. Professor Sullivan is the author of 3 books, one called Machiavelli's 3 Romes, the second, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and the Formation of liberal republicanism in England, and a third on Montesquieu and the despotic ideas of Europe. She's edited 2 books, a collection of essays on Machiavelli's literary writings, which Professor Tarkov is translating, has been translating Machiavelli's literary writings. themselves, not Professor Sullivan's anthology, although if I could recommend. And secondly, a collection of essays on Shakespeare, Shakespeare's political pageant. She has spent a lot of time thinking about Montesquieu and thinking about Persian letters, and I can think of no one better to have to talk to us about the depopulation letters and Persian letters than Professor Sullivan. Please join me in welcoming her to the Montesquieu Forum.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with Professor Warner's colleagues and students and my former teachers. I think the most important thing that I can say to Professor Warner's students is you don't know how lucky you are to have a professor who has translated the work you are studying. There really isn't anyone who knows that work, this work, the Persian letters, better than Stuart Warner. And his knowledge actually made me proud to be an American. Because back in 2021, it was the anniversary of the publication of the Persian letters. The work was published in 1721, and there were a lot of conferences, and Stuart attended them, and I attended some of them, and I was at one conference, and there was a French scholar there who was absolutely astounded and took me aside and said, I thought it was only the French scholars who could talk about the Persian letters in this way. That is, by referring to numbers. Oh yes, there's letter 67. Don't forget letter 26. And she was completely astounded. And she said, I didn't know you Americans could do that.
We play bingo.
But to be fair, it's not the Americans, it is Professor Warner. And you students are really blessed to have him as a professor. So, I'm going to speak to you today about the letters on population. And there are three series of letters in the Persian letters. There are the troglodyte letters. They occur early in the work. Uzbek writes 4 letters. And then there's also another series of letters, Rika's letters on a library. Rika writes 5 letters in that series. The letters on population are written by Uzbek, and there are 10 letters that Uzbek actually writes. The troglodyte letters have received a lot of attention in the scholarship. Some scholars attribute the views of Uzbek in those letters to Montesquieu. I think there are very strong reasons to concentrate and focus on the letters on population if one really wants to approach Montesquieu's views. First of all, there's a longer series in the work. I also think that Montesquieu is interested in character development in the work. And these letters occur, they're written in the story of the work in 1718. So Uzbek has been in France for 6 years. He arrived in 1712. And I think there are good reasons, and I'm not going to get into them tonight, but I think there are good reasons to believe that Montesquieu shows how Uzbek, his character, has imbibed the views and thoughts of Paris intellectuals. But I think there's an even more important reason, and that is some of the ideas that appear in the letters of population reappear in the spirit of the laws. And that may not be saying much, because I know that students are studying Persian letters and not the spirit of the laws. This is the spirit of the laws. It was written in 1748. In the preface, Montesquieu says that he has spent 20 years writing it, and that it contains an infinite number of things. He is not a humble man. But if there's an infinite number of things in that work, it shouldn't be surprising that a few of them from the letters on population appear in that work. So I'm going to up the ante. Some of the subjects in the letters of population are at what I think are the core of Montesquieu's thoughts. And I think those thoughts come to view in various ways. When Montesquieu uses the superlative, which he rarely does. When he speaks in personal, emotional terms. And then, when he uses the term legislator. He rarely uses the term, but the work is about the spirit of the laws. I am working on, every time he uses the term legislator in the spirit of the laws, he uses it 78 times. In a book that has infinite things, 78 times is not a lot, but when he uses it, I think it's really important. So this, I think, it tells us something about Montesquieu. It is common in the scholarship to suggest that Montesquieu, in the spirit of the laws, his magnum opus, offers observations and descriptions, that he's open to particularism. And even before that, he was associated with a proto-scientific neutrality, that he was interested in observation and not in prescription. But I think when Montesquieu uses the term legislator and says, this is what a wise legislator will do, a bad legislator would do this, then I think Montesquieu is being prescriptive, and that those prescriptions focus on the issues that he raises in the letters of population. So my thesis is this, that the ideas that are conveyed in this early work, in the person of a Persian, in this series of letters, will blossom and will become really what I regard as the sacred heart of the spirit of the laws, what really matters for Montesquieu. What those things are, first of all, he's very concerned with population. And I think that can translate in some regards to really what he's interested in is human flourishing. And the Spirit of the Laws contains 31 books. He devotes one book, one entire book, to the following. On laws in their relation to the number of inhabitants. And within that book, there is a chapter, chapter 16, that says the following. The views of the legislator on the propagation of the species. So the legislator should be interested, is interested in the laws and how to increase the population. Now, when I use the term legislator, I mean lawgiver. It's like a founder. It's not, Montesquieu is not using it in the sense of someone who is participating in a legislative assembly. It is a lawgiver. So just the mere fact that there is a book, book 23, on population in Spirit of the Laws. And then, in addition, second, he talks about the mildness of government, that is important. Uzbek says that is important. And I think that theme of mildness of government blossoms and becomes a central focus in what I think is one of the most important books of the Spirit of the Laws, Book 6 on criminal laws. Another theme that Uzbek writes about in the Letters on Population is the importance of the encouragement of labor. And that too blossoms and is emphasized in Book 14 of the Spirit of the Laws. Another theme is slavery and his condemnation of slavery. Uzbek, in the Letters on Population, condemns it. Montesquieu condemns it. And he blames slavery on the existence of bad laws, bad legislators. And finally, he speaks in emotional terms, superlative terms, regarding what he regards as the crimes of the Spaniards in the New World. All of that is contained in the Persian letters, Uzbek's Letters on Population, and they blossom those themes blossom in the Spirit of the Laws. So, I'm going to give you just a brief introduction to the Letters on Population. The story in the Persian letters unfolds like this. Reddy, who is a nephew of a friend of Uzbek, writes to Uzbek to observe the following. Depopulation is the most terrible catastrophe that has ever happened in the world. But it has scarcely been perceived because it has happened insensibly and over the course of a great number of centuries. And Reddy says this marks an interior vice, a secret and hidden poison, a malady of lethargy afflicting humankind. And in response to that, Uzbek writes 10 letters. And thanks to Professor Warner's very helpful support for the work, we know that Uzbek doesn't write any other letters. He spends the next weeks only responding to Reddy, at least in the version that Montesquieu presents to us. What Uzbek responds initially and then continues to maintain through those 10 letters is that it is not a physical cause that is resulting in depopulation. It is a moral cause. His letters, in treating this moral cause, treat various themes, but what is particularly striking about the letters is its treatment of religion, both Christianity and Islam. According to Uzbek, both religions are a key component of the moral causes that adversely affect population. Uzbek says this, it's letter 114. Since the Christian and Mohammedan religions have divided the Roman world, things have changed a great deal. These two religions are very far from being as favorable to the propagation of the species as was that of the Romans. And I'm going to give you a taste of how radical Uzbek's view of this is when he condemns the practice of celibacy in Christianity. Uzbek writes, "This profession of continence, that is in monasteries, has annihilated more men than plagues and the bloodiest wars men have ever seen. In every religious house, an eternal family can be seen where no one is born and which maintains itself at the expense of all the others. These houses are always open like so many pits in which future generations are to be buried." That's really quite striking. It's no wonder that Montesquieu wanted to be anonymous when these letters were published. He also says, in the voice of Uzbek, "Monasticism carries death everywhere." Montesquieu has his character Uzbek also criticize his own religion and his own culture. Uzbek provides a quote from the Quran and then says, "Your wives are your tillage. The prophet says, approach your tillage. I regard a good Muslim as an athlete destined to fight without any rest, but who, soon weak and overwhelmed from his first toils, languishes in the very field of his victory and finds himself, so to speak, buried beneath his own triumphs." And then, as a commentary on this, Uzbek says, "It is very common among us to see a man in a prodigious seraglio with a very small number of children. These children themselves are most time weak and unhealthy, and they themselves feel the languor of their father." And I'm sure the students in Professor Warner's class have discussed the state of Uzbek seraglio and its progeny or lack thereof. Now I'm going to turn to the specifics of these themes that are elaborated, I think, in the Spirit of the Laws. As I mentioned, there is a book devoted to this topic in the Spirit of the Laws on men and animals' relation to the multiplication of their species. It is a strange book. It begins with a 15-line quotation from Lucretius on the nature of things. It is very much about fertility and nature's call to the animal world to replicate itself. It is a poem to Venus. So right after this poetic introduction, Montesquieu says the fertility of female animals is virtually consistent. But then he speaks of human beings and draws a contrast. In the human species, the way of thinking, character, passions, fantasies, caprices, the idea of preserving one's beauty, the encumbrances of pregnancy, that of a too numerous family, disturbed propagation in 1,000 ways. So Montesquieu is making the same point that Uzbek makes to Reddy, that when we look at human beings, And as we've seen in his concern, Uzbek's concern with religion and monasticism, those moral concerns relate firstly to religion. The first chapter of Book 23 on population says, regulations concerning the number of inhabitants depend greatly on circumstances. There are countries where nature has done everything. The legislator, therefore, has done nothing. But he specifies this is not the case in Europe. As the book on population continues, Montesquieu indicates that Europe is in a precarious place with respect to population. And he says in chapter 26 of that book, one must conclude that Europe today is an instance of the case that laws need to favor the propagation of the human species. Why is that the case? He will, as we will see, concentrate more on Southern Europe than on Northern Europe. And I think that that is related to Catholicism as opposed to Protestantism. But he has a really moving chapter called The Depopulation of the Universe. And he gives a long view of history. In the beginning, during the time of the Greeks and the Romans, the population of Europe, he maintains, flourished. And then Rome arose and conquered, and then fell into civil war, and as a result of that, the Roman population that had engrossed Europe was decimated. And as a result of that, emperors, namely Augustus, had to institute laws that favored marriage and children, that encouraged marriage, encouraged children, such as allowing women, this is just one example of what a legislator could do, allowing women with children to inherit. And Montesquieu says that these civil laws that were first propounded by Augustus, he says they form the finest part of the Roman civil laws. There's a superlative. That these laws that encourage population after the decimation of the universe are the finest civil laws of Rome. The story does not end there, though. Ultimately, the Romans, these very Romans who had the finest of civil laws, became Christian. And through that time, there were lawgivers. Justinian, he did the Code of Justinian, and he was a Christian. And what Montesquieu shows in that book is the way in which Justinian, in the spirit of favoring Christianity, worked against marriage and worked against population. He says, for example, that under the original civil laws, if a wife's husband was away somewhere, serving as a soldier and didn't return, one could assume that the husband was deceased and the woman could remarry. That's reasonable. Various Christian emperors extended that, put more onerous demands on it, and said, for example, and Montesquieu comments They wanted a positive proof of the husband's demise when a negative one would have sufficed. And then Montesquieu provides another example. That is, Justinian's code allowed for divorce only in the cases when both husband and wife wanted to enter a monastery. And Montesquieu comments, this law runs counter to the fundamental principle of divorce, which suffers the dissolution of one marriage only in the expectation of another. And then he declares, Montesquieu, this very moderate, temperate person who rarely wants to give his opinion, says, the law succeeds only in giving victims to God. So we see here, I think, the fundamental connection between the letters of population and Montesquieu's own views in his own name. So, again, just to underscore it, in the Persian letters, Uzbek says, monasticism carries death everywhere, and they're an abyss that swallow up future generations. And again, in 23, he says, the state of Europe is one that calls for a legislator. And at the very least, what Montesquieu is doing is trying to teach a legislator. And one wonders if that means that Montesquieu himself is a type of legislator. So this second theme that I think is very important and that carries from the Persian letters, the character Uzbek, into the spirit of the laws is mildness. And it's a sentence. It's in letter 122. Uzbek says, mildness, douceur, of government contributes marvelously to the propagation of the species. Mild government. And I looked it up, and I think the only time that Montesquieu speaks in the spirit of the laws of mildness of government is with respect to monarchy. He says, in our monarchies, all felicity consists in the opinion that the people has in the mildness of government. An unskillful minister always wants to tell you that you are slaves. So it tells you something important about his view of a good monarchy versus a bad monarchy. But I think there's more going on there. I think, to use the theme again, that mildness blossoms in spirit of the laws with respect to all government. And I think that comes to sight really prominently in Book 6, which is on criminal laws, criminal judgments, and penalties. And interestingly, Montesquieu uses the term in French for legislator the most in any book in the entire book, in this particular book. So he's really concerned with legislators. And in chapter 12 of book 6, entitled On the Power of Penalties, Montesquieu says, Experience has shown that in the countries where penalties are gentle, there's the same word, deuce, the citizen spirit is struck by them as is elsewhere. So notice, he's not saying in a particular type of government, in a particular country, he is saying in countries, all countries. He explains that the imagination, sorry, that's not me. No, good. That makes me happy. That the human spirit becomes inured to the heaviness of a penalty. And what happens then is that the spirit of human beings is corrupted. And he declares, men must not be led to extremes. One should manage the means that nature gives us to guide them. Let us follow nature, which has given men shame for their scourge, and let the greatest part of the penalty be the infamy of suffering it. And then he speaks of a legislator in almost oracular terms. A legislator who wants to correct an ill often thinks only of that correction. His eye is on the object and not on its defects. Once the ill has been corrected, only the harshness of the legislator is seen, but a vice produced by the harshness remains in the state. Spirits are corrupted. They have become accustomed to despotism. This really powerful statement appears as its own paragraph without any explanation. The reader must consider the possible instances of such a harsh legislator. But Montesquieu would not be, or is not, such a legislator. He declares, and now I think he's being prescriptive, a wise legislator would have sought to lead men's spirits back by a just tempering of penalties and rewards, by maxims of philosophy, morality, and religion, and by the enjoyment of a constant happiness and a sweet, mild tranquility. So here he is prescribing how a legislator could reform a harsh society. One may reflect on such harsh societies in the Europe of his time and how Montesquieu would react to them. So third, the third theme I want to concentrate on is on the cultivation of the earth. And that theme arises in letter 120. Montesquieu is opposed, let me correct that, is opposed to the antipathy for work and cultivation of the soil. And he says that that aversion to work creates a sparse population. He returns to that topic, I think, very powerfully in Book 14 on climate. And again, he says something that is a superlative. The cultivation of the land is the greatest labor of man. The more their climate inclines them to flee this labor, the more their religion and laws rouse them to it. The more their religion and laws should rouse them to it. And then he speaks about hot climates where people tend not to want to work. And there's something true there. I don't know if you've ever gone to archives in Italy when it's really hot outside, but the last thing one wants to do is to stay awake. So he says that this is a condition and that the legislator has to deal with it. The people of these climates have greater need of a wise legislator than the peoples of our own. The more easily and forcefully one is impressed, the more important it is to be impressed in a suitable manner, to accept no prejudices, and to be led by reason. I'll just briefly note that in this book, Book 14, he praises in emphatic terms the Chinese legislators who induced human beings to cultivate the soil, and he notices aspects of their culture, of the traditions of the emperors, who will go out and plow a field to open the spring farming, the season for farming. He notices their practical religion, and he contrasts China to Southern Europe. In Southern Europe, where peoples are so impressed by the point of honor, it could be well to give prizes to the plowmen who had best cultivated their lands and to the workers who had been most industrious. This is what we need to do in Europe, where it is hot. So I will just recognize two other areas. One is in slavery. And he does talk in the Letters on Population in 118. He turns to Africa in 18 and says, we have nothing more to say about Asia and Europe. So he turns to Africa in that letter. And I think that's somewhat deceptive on Uzbek's part, because Europe is very much the focus, which is this, that Europe has transplanted individuals from Africa to serve as slaves in the New World. And he says, there is nothing as extravagant as causing an innumerable number of men to perish so as to extract gold and silver from the depths of the earth. He offers biting sarcasm of slavery in the spirit of the laws, in his own name. He says this: the peoples of Europe, having exterminated those of America, had to make slaves of those of Africa in order to use them to clear so much land. If you agree to that, you are countenancing the extermination of the people of America. He is very critical of the notion that slavery is justified in the Americas to convert people to Christianity. And then he does not, it is true, he does not ultimately condemn slavery as unjust. His weapon is sarcasm. And in fact, the only time that he uses the term in the entire spirit of the laws of an unjust law, he's quoting Augustine, a Christian. So he's not going to be that type of crusader, but he's going to make us see the harshness, the atrocity that is in slavery, that is and supports slavery. And ultimately, I think what he does in that book is condemn bad legislators. The only reason why we have slavery is bad legislators. He says, there is no work so arduous that one cannot adjust it to the strength of the one who does it, provided that reason and not avarice regulates it. With the convenience of machines, so he looks to technology, he says one can replace the forced labor that elsewhere is done by slaves. And then he says, I do not know if my spirit or my heart dictates this point. And so this is one of the instances where he refers to his own passions, his own view, and I think he wants to convey that to his readers. But he says this, perhaps there is no climate on earth where one could not engage free men to work. And if that's the case, you don't need slavery. And then he says, because the laws were made badly, lazy men appeared. Because these men were lazy, they were enslaved. Ultimately, what he blames is bad laws that can overcome what he regards it as an atrocity. Finally, in the Persian letters, he condemns Spain. The Spanish, despairing of ensuring the faithfulness of the vanquished nations, made the decision to exterminate the peoples of America. Never was a horrible plan been more punctually executed. A people as numerous as all those of Europe together was seen to disappear from the earth upon the arrival of these barbarians. So he's calling the Spanish Uzbek barbarians. And he does something very similar in the spirit of the laws. In Book 8, Chapter 18, he says, in order to hold America, Spain did what despotism itself does not do. It destroyed the inhabitants. And then in another early book of the Spirit of the Laws, Book 4, Montesquieu says of the pillages of the Spaniards in the New World, it was one of the greatest wounds mankind has yet received. So it's quite clear where Montesquieu stands on this. So my point in conclusion is that key elements that Uzbek articulates in his letters on population recur in the spirit of the laws. Not only do they reoccur, but I think they do so in a very important way. That is, they reoccur when Montesquieu speaks in moving terms meant to elicit a similarly emotional response in his readers, or when he praises or condemns legislators. So, for you, students of the Persian letters, I want to make the argument that through this person of Uzbek, which is problematic, Montesquieu is giving you really important aspects of the spirit of the laws. And I think they are really important aspects because those are the aspects where Montesquieu, who doesn't like wants to be accepting of other cultures, other practices, and indeed he is. But it's on these very issues that he speaks up, he is moved, he speaks in superlative terms, and so I think in reading the Persian letters, you have approached the sacred core of the spirit of the laws. All right. Thank you very much.
We'll take comments, questions.
I would love to.
About Persian letters.
Anything, anything. Although, given the fact that Professor Warren is here, and that you are studying the work of Professor Warren, and you are immersed in it, I have no doubt that you are well equipped to understand this work. And I think if anybody has ever understood it, it's Professor Warren. So I might defer to you.
This is not increasing your honorarium.
You sure?
If anything,
But I would love to discuss these themes with your students or with anyone else. Yes, Professor Como.
I mean, but if a student wants to go first, that's fine with me. Okay.
it's too late now.
I'm thinking of letter number 83, where Uzbek. This is a response to your description of mildness and the
Yeah.
importance of mildness. You know, in that letter, he gives the impression if there were no God enforcing eternal laws of justice, then, and I'm sorry, this is not Stewart's translation.
Yeah. It is or it isn't.
It isn't.
Okay.
Without that, we would be in continual fear. We would walk in front of men as before lions, and never for a moment be sure of our property, our honor, or our lives. Given that Montesquieu probably didn't believe that God was in his heaven protecting our hearth and home, isn't that kind of a strong endorsement of harsh laws to protect us from the lions?
If there is a God, my dear Reddy, he must necessarily be just. For if he were not, he would be the most evil and most imperfect of all beings. I am absolutely convinced that Montesquieu, maybe not Uzbek, but Montesquieu is very, very serious about mildness of laws. And I am going to refer to the spirit of the laws. He says at one point, it is a despotic rage that decree that children should be punished for the crimes of their father. You could find that on earth. You can certainly find that in the scripture. And so Montesquieu, I think, certainly, absolutely, Professor Como, that Montesquieu is concerned about doing away with crimes, minimizing it, that we can be subject to the deprivations of other individuals, and that is concerning. And I think you that what's even more concerning to Montesquieu is when all the power of government can come to bear against an individual who is accused. And that, I think, is where he's very concerned about protecting individuals. And again, it's about when he speaks in superlatives. And I don't think this gets enough press. He says, the most important knowledge available to human beings, you should probably pay attention, is the correct way to proceed in criminal judgments. And how to read Uzbek, I think, is another issue that comes up when you reduce letter 83. I have been told not to give away anything. But Uzbek is a very problematic character. He is something of a hypocrite. And he doesn't always see how things apply to him. And I think, and I'm not sure I can prove it, but the best things we can do with a book that's this deep and this intricate and this nuanced is make guesses. Good. Try to make the best guesses we can. I think Montesquieu writes himself into this in a way. The preface says, hey, these Persians, I got to know them, we were good friends, we lived together. But in the letters itself, you never know who this person is, this Frenchman who houses these Persians, Uzbek and Rika. But in that same preface, he says, oh, I just collected these letters. And then he's like, no, what I really did is I arranged them and I edited them. And so we don't really know what's going on, and there are asterisks, which an editor must have done. So the one way I can respond to this also is to say, at a certain point, Uzbek might have been really full of Montesquieu. And so I don't think we can possibly say Uzbek is consistent in his views. And he certainly doesn't apply all of these very enlightened views to himself. So I think my response is somehow, and it's kind of cute, it's fun, it's very Montesquieuian, that he would create a character and create a time when that character is completely and utterly imbued with the spirit of Montesquieu. So I guess that's a long-winded response. I'm not going to take everything Uzbek says. I don't think Uzbek as consistent, and I am absolutely convinced of Montesquieu's sincerity about mildness. And in that really, as I called it, oracular passage that, a legislator is concentrated on his corrections. He's so focused on his corrections that he doesn't see the abuses that emanate from the correction themselves. That may be Montesquieu responding to other legislators who are philosophic. This is a big giveaway. In Book 29, Chapter 19, Montesquieu gives us a chapter on legislators. And he's talked about a lot of legislators. He's actually doesn't mention any of these ancient legislators. He doesn't mention Justinian. He doesn't mention St. Louis of France, who was a legislator. He mentions Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Harrington, and more. So, he's looking, I think, ultimately on thinkers, philosophers, writers, who tell us how to think about things. And I think Montesquieu is really interested in that, and I think he sees himself as a legislator, or at the very least, a legislator of legislators. Students? Yes, please. What's your name?
Yasmina.
Okay, Rosalind.
Make sure you pronounce her name correctly.
Can you do it for me, Ron?
I can't.
So I was thinking of your third point about the cultivation of the earth
Yeah.
and Montesquieu's sort of doubling down why it's so important in vibe respect. What do you make of the fact that he made the eunuchs such a large portion of? I mean, their characters are just so, you can't ignore them. And so I think it's intriguing. And I kind of wanted to know what you think about his inclusion of the letters that eunuchs wrote, because he didn't have to, but I mean, in considering your third point.
Yeah, no, he's very concerned with the eunuchs. And I think your question is a really good one, because what we're talking about, right, is the propagation of the species, and the eunuchs are incapable of that, and they're also slaves. And they also do the work. Admittedly, their work is refined because they are in a luxurious seraglio, but they are doing work that other individuals, the elite, aren't doing for themselves. And so the letters of population have to work against the very institution of the seraglio. But yes, and it's strange, we have to ask, how did these letters, I think there are 2 of them, from one eunuch to another, we have to ask, how did they get here? How did they get in the hands of this editor? But what those letters reveal is the humanity of these individuals, how they have adapted to that enslavement, sometimes in very poignant ways. One writes to, an elder writes to a younger and says, you know, I have no sense of fatherhood, but if I did, I would regard you as my progeny. So that's very moving. On the other hand, there's something that is less endearing about them, which is they are subjugated, they are exploited, and they are going to take those frustrations out on the women whom they guard, and that results in cruelties and also forms of despotism. So, yeah, the letters of population really bear on that. And I think what's really important, and actually there's another scholar said, this is really, those letters are the first time in European, and I'm quoting someone else, I'm paraphrasing someone, first time in European literature that you have one slave writing to another slave in literature on a human plane. And Montesquieu did that, which I think is really important. But Uzbek is at the pinnacle of a despotic domestic regime. So he expresses some things and doesn't act on it. And that's something right about human beings. It's really easy for us to notice in others practices that diverge from justice and virtue, and it's much more difficult to apply that to ourselves, especially when, it's something that's been culturally ingrained. Is there anything you want to say about those letters? What struck you?
No, I do think it speaks to like the humanity, and I find it interesting. I think as like we get further along that, and I just think that now I'm considering your points too. In a way, the eunuchs, they're the opposite of mildness because they're in a way legislators, but the legislators almost that Montesquieu condemns, but they're forced to be that.
Mhm.
And so I think
They're victims.
right.
They're perpetrators and victims at the same time.
Yes. So I do think I agree. I didn't know actually that was the first time there were letters written. But yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, your name.
Jameson.
Jameson.
Jameson. Thank you again for
Yeah, thank you.
coming this evening. I wanted to talk about actually the premier black eunuch, which is I believe the one that you cited when you were
Right.
discussing I can't experience fatherhood.
Right.
Because even that letter is quite twisted in that he describes, selfishly, I did enjoy when you yourself became a eunuch, that process. And the premier black eunuch features a lot in this work. I think it's curious that he's introduced with, these letters of my life has been so difficult and the women despise me and my situation, and, he's in his 50s. But then as the book goes on, he's writing to Uzbek about, I found you another wife, or rather I bought you another wife, or
He's participating in the international slave trade.
yeah, and he gets angry at one of the other slaves and decides that he should be your next eunuch, even though he is, way past the age that we typically do that.
Yeah.
And so I've talked to Professor Warner about this a lot, how they are a reflection of, as you said, the despotism. But we have an interesting analogy going in our class that Uzbek is the Seraglio's absent god. And I think it's very fascinating that this eunuch in particular, who's had such a difficult life, is kind of carrying the seeds that Uzbek planted and taking them even further when Uzbek has been gone for now
Wow.
7, 8 years.
That's awesome.
So I just wanted to know what
Yeah.
your thoughts are on this, because the question of religion, as we've discussed, every time he's talking about Islam, he's making a comparison to Christianity. He's talking about Isfahan, he wants us to think about Paris. I wanted to know what you thought about this idea.
Right. First, I'm going to take your reflections on eunuch. First of all, again, it's sort of the ambivalence of the position. He is very low on the totem pole. He's a slave, but when he writes to his protege, he says, yes, I enjoy the notion that he would be raised to my level. And another reflection I have is just an elaboration, I think, on your insight, which is that they can be these practices that are despotic. People can recognize they're despotic and still practice them. And Professor Warner asked me today, as we were driving over here, why the title of the book, Despotic Ideas? Well, in the spirit of the laws, he does use the term that there are despotic ideas, and then those despotic ideas foster practices, and they can become ingrained. And I think Montesquieu, by speaking, movingly so I think your insight is that on the one hand, the eunuch has suffered at the hands of the despot, and now the despot, like an absent God, is no longer there, and what does the eunuch do? Acts like a acts like a despot. And I think, and I haven't really put it in these terms before, but I think that's really what I think Montesquieu is showing us, and that's really what I was trying to show in my book, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of the Persian letters in that way.
Yeah, and we could even assume that he gets a pass under the guise of flattery, which is the other big theme that we talked about a lot, that this is the world that he was confined to, and so it's all he knows, and I think that in his mind maybe it's a very noble thing that he's following in the footsteps of his, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah, and to laugh, it is a noble thing. And the other thing that the eunuch talks about constantly is virtue and purity. And those types of, as you said, sort of noble aspirations can be used to justify oppressive, despotic practices. And so I think Montesquieu, through the eunuchs, is revealing that. Thank you. Yes. You, yes. What's your name?
Ben.
Ben.
So we've been talking in class recently about the way that the idea of virginity appears in the book and its importance its importance towards women and kind of these strange ideas surrounding it. Like there's this letter that I think Zoe writes to Uzbek talking about this.
Who does? I didn't hear.
I think Zoe.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Silly.
And so there's this letter where this young man, commits this awful
Right.
offense against the father of this girl,
Right.
where he does horrible things to her and rejects her as a wife because after their wedding night she's no longer a virgin. Something I was thinking about in relation to this idea is how eunuchs apply to this, because it's considered this great tragedy that they're basically men being separated from their nature,
Right.
and they're not able to have sex anymore. So there's kind of this strange relationship where women lose their purity and their kind of angelic qualities whenever they have sex, even
Yep.
if they're married. Whereas for men, it's a great tragedy. So I wanted to
It's
ask for your
Yeah.
comment on that.
Could you just elaborate what you mean by for men it's a great tragedy?
Well,
For
sorry.
women-
For men, it would be a great tragedy to become eunuchs,
Oh, okay, yeah.
to lose
Yeah. Okay.
their nature.
Right.
So I wanted to ask for your comment on that relationship, and then I also wanted to ask, what do you think, if Montesquieu's kind of cooking up these ideas next to each other, what do you think is his view on the matter, especially since he's talking about population and depopulation? What do you think he thought of the way that men and women should view sex?
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Okay. The other letter that I would broach with respect to the issue of virginity as it's depicted in the Persian letters is letter 26, where Roxanne, who is the new favorite of Roosevelt, apparently, defends herself against his advances after their marriage, and Uzbek thinks it's a sign of her great virtue. And it's a powerful letter because what Uzbek is unknowingly describing, and I'm sure you discussed this in class, is a rape by the husband. So is that moral causes, human ideas, can really get in the way of human productivity or human flourishing. And then you ask the very good question of what is Montesquieu's view of this? I'll say something first that's not controversial, and then I'm going to say something that's controversial. The first thing I'm going to say is controversial is book 19. I recommend it to you. It's about, it's really about the spirit of various peoples, nations, and it really compares the French nation and the English nation. And the English, well, the French nation has a joie de vivre, he uses that term, and we have sort of a joy in living and in sociality that induces people to come to us and to visit. And that's true, I think. I think it's still true. But then he says, and we have a way, and admittedly, he's talking about the upper class. We bring women out into the public, and they lend a type of gaiety to society. And he says, and yeah, and he said, speaking in his own voice, and he uses the term our. It's always first person plural. So he's talking about the French. He doesn't even say the French, but you know he's talking about the French. And he says, yeah, sometimes we're a little indiscreet. But look at the good things that come from it. And he does not condemn it. So that's one way we can think about how Montesquieu thinks about the relations. The other thing I'm going to say is a little more controversial. I think it's the letter with, it's Rika's letter, yes. I'm not, sorry, Professor Werner, I'm not going to name the number. But Rika talks about, I'm now living in a house with other women, men and women together. And I don't think it's such a bad thing. And he says, up until this point, I really didn't understand women because virtue was so enforced that we didn't get the development of individuals, just individual personalities, individual faculties that can blossom when there isn't these impositions of a very austere, rigorous virtue. And then, I could be wrong, but then he says, a gallant philosopher said to me that women maybe are superiors because they are softer, they are gentler, and they could dominate over us, but they wouldn't want to do it. And so that's pretty radical, and commentators have said really about that particular letter, that particular statement that's in the mouth of Rika, that you could say that Montesquieu is the font of the liberation, the women's liberation movement. A scholar by the name of Kessler said that once. But you have to ask, who is that gallant philosopher? Maybe. That's more controversial. But it's not completely out of character. And scholars could object, like Montesquieu's referring to himself as gallant. But I think he is. I mean, I think book 19 sort of reveals that there's a sort of a deep appreciation, on a serious level, a deep appreciation of women and what they do. Also, says some positive things, he says some negative things. But I think one thing I take, he does say that's positive, and I really take it as a positive. He's not being, there's no irony here or sarcasm. He says that Christianity brought women out of their homes and into the congregations. And that really was a positive thing for social life. The other thing, again, when he thinks of the relationship between men and women, he likes the English Constitution a lot. If you're going to read Spirit of the Laws, read the preface, read Book 11, Chapter 6, which is on the Constitution of England, it's very important, and read 1927, which is on the mores of England. And when it comes to the mores, it's really critical. The women don't have any role in the social life of England. The men go out and they drink, and they leave women at home. And I can't remember the exact term, but he says that leaves men to a type of dissoluteness, I think. And what the suggestion there is, he's vague, he's being somewhat prudish, but I think what he really means is by not having a social world that includes women, that it's a less joyful environment, and it leads men to engage in prostitution. So when you compare the two societies, on that score, I think France comes out on top.
We have time for one more question.
One more question. Yes.
Yeah, you emphasize the importance of the legislator, but I was thinking about the episode of the Troglodytes,
Yeah.
in which the legislator seems to be severely deprecated toward the end there, right?
Yeah, the king.
Yeah, I mean, do I understand? Is this a myth within how do you put those together?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. No, it's a really good question, and it's really one of the reasons that sort of motivated me to focus on these letters. Because the troglodyte letters happened very early. He hasn't entered Europe yet. So he hasn't been exposed to any European ideas. And the king says things like, you want me to enforce virtue, so you no longer want to practice virtue for yourself. And there are scholars who say that is Montesquieu. And there's a pretty recent, famous, influential account of Montesquieu that says that that's Montesquieu, and as a result of that, he's very wary of commerce, because the king doesn't like that sort of building up a nation. I just don't think that works. Montesquieu is very favorable to commerce, and we actually see it in the letters of population, where he says, in order to have commerce, you need a lot of people. So, yes, the type of virtue that the troglodytes practice is one in which there are two men who raise families. The families grow, but they don't have government, and they inculcate in their progeny a real respect for virtue that is a real type of altruism.
please join me in thanking
Yeah.
Professor